It was supposed to be a quiet weekend alone. My parents had left for a trip, and I was eager for some solitude, nestled in the comfort of our home on the edge of the woods. The only sounds were the steady tick of the old clock in the living room and the faint chirping of crickets outside. I sat near the window, my book open but unread, my attention continually drawn to the pond at the edge of our yard. That pond. Even during the day, it made me uneasy. The black water always looked too still, too deep. At night, it was worse. The darkness clung to it like a secret it was determined to keep. The house was quiet, but I wasn't feeling peaceful. Something about that night felt off. The wind barely stirred the trees, but every so often, I thought I saw something shift in the corner of my eye. At first, I dismissed it. The woods could play tricks on your mind when you were alone, I told myself. Then I heard it, a faint splash, almost like someone slipping into the water. My body tensed immediately. I strained to listen. Another splash, this one louder, followed by the distinct sound of water being disturbed. Not like an animal, but slow and deliberate, like footsteps through the pond. I turned my head toward the window, heart pounding in my chest. The trees swayed gently, but there was no wind. I could barely make out the surface of the pond through the branches, its inky blackness reflecting nothing. Another splash. I froze, every hair on my neck standing on end. Someone was out there. Someone or something. I moved silently to the back door, creeping through the house with my breath held. The air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath with me. The old door creaked slightly as I cracked it open, and I stepped outside into the cool night air, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. The splashing had stopped. My eyes locked onto the pond, trying to see through the shadows. At first, I saw nothing but the still water, the reflection of the trees on the surface. Then a figure, standing there, half submerged in the water, motionless. They were barely visible, a tall, dark silhouette. Their back to me, their head turned just enough that I could tell they were staring into the woods. They didn't move. They just stood there in the water, as if waiting for something. My heart slammed against my ribs as I crouched behind the porch railing, too scared to breathe. Who was that? There was no one else around for miles. No one should have been here. I wanted to shout at them, but the words were stuck in my throat. The figure shifted slightly, almost as if they were listening. The slow, deliberate movements reminded me of someone wading through thick mud. I could hear the soft drip of water sliding off their clothes. They started moving again, walking deeper into the pond. That's when I noticed something unnatural. The water wasn't reacting the way it should have. The ripples didn't spread, didn't disturb the surface beyond where they stood. It was like they were gliding through it, the water parting silently, obediently. They stopped, turning slowly toward the house, toward me. My breath caught, my hands trembling as I gripped the porch railing. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were looking directly at me. My body refused to move as the figure stood there, half hidden by the trees, completely still. The silence between us felt suffocating. Then, they took a step toward the house. I stumbled backward, my foot hitting the door behind me. The sudden sound seemed to break the spell. The figure paused, frozen in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was trapped. My eyes locked on that shadowy form just beyond the trees. Without warning, they turned and walked back into the pond, vanishing into the water as if they had never been there. The night closed in again, the oppressive silence swallowing the sound of the last ripples. I stood there, my body trembling with fear, unable to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I wanted to believe it had been a trick of the light, but I knew better. There was something, or someone, out there, lurking in the shadows of the pond. And whatever it was, it had noticed me. It was late, far later than I should have been out. The cold wind cut through my jacket as I hurried along the dimly lit street, the parking lot ahead of me barely visible under flickering street lamps. It was one of those late October nights where the darkness feels too heavy, like it's pressing in on you, suffocating. I hated walking at night, but my car was parked at the far end of the lot, away from the busier streets. I told myself it was fine. Just a few more minutes, I reassured myself, and I'd be home. The air was still, and aside from the distant hum of traffic, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. As I neared the lot, the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind me, just out of sync with my own. I paused, glancing over my shoulder, my pulse quickening. Nothing. The street was empty, except for a few parked cars. I shook my head and kept walking, picking up my pace. Then I heard it, a voice, small and muffled, coming from somewhere near the cars. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. "Help!" The voice whispered, faint but unmistakable. A child's voice. My stomach churned. The sound was coming from between two parked cars just ahead. I stood frozen, the wind biting in my skin. The rational part of my brain screamed that something was wrong, but I couldn't ignore it. A child alone at this hour? I swallowed hard and stepped toward the cars, my feet dragging as if my body was fighting the decision. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. There was no response, just an oppressive silence that hung in the air. I edged closer, leaning down a pier between the vehicles, and then I saw it. A small figure crouched on the ground, curled up tight. They were wearing a dirty hoodie, the fabric pulled over their head, and they were shivering. "Hey, are you okay?" I whispered, kneeling down. Something felt horribly wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't leave a kid here. They didn't respond, just stayed curled up, rocking slightly. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. It didn't feel right. None of this did. "I'm going to help you, okay?" I said, forcing my voice to sound steady. I reached out, hesitating for a second, then gently touched their shoulder. The figure flinched violently, a sharp, jerking motion that made me yank my hand back. The hoodie slipped slightly, and for the briefest moment, I saw a glimpse of their face. It wasn't a child. What I saw, it wasn't right. The skin was pale, stretched too tight, the eyes sunken, lifeless, staring back at me from the shadows of the hood. I couldn't breathe. My heart slammed against my chest as I stumbled backward, falling onto the cold pavement. The figure didn't move, just stayed there, crouched and still, their head tilting slightly as if they were observing me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but I couldn't. It didn't make sense. That face, those eyes. And then I realized something else. There was no breath, no sound of breathing, no movement beyond that subtle, eerie tilt of the head. It wasn't alive. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat. I backed away, my eyes locked on the figure as it slowly, impossibly began to rise. The way it moved was all wrong, like it was struggling against some invisible weight, limbs jerking unnaturally. It straightened to full height, far too tall for a child, and stood there, facing me but not moving any closer. It just stared. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I sprinted through the lot, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, every instinct screaming at me to get out. The parking lot stretched on forever, and with every step, I felt something behind me like cold eyes boring into my back. I didn't dare look. As I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once, twice. The air felt thick, like the darkness itself was pressing down on me. I could feel it, whatever it was standing at the edge of the lot, just out of sight, watching. I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, locking it behind me with trembling fingers. I glanced up through the windshield, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. There was no one there, but I knew it was still there, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. I drove home in a daze, the radio blaring just to fill the silence, but the unease never left me. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave it behind. Sometimes when I walk to my car at night, I still hear that faint, muffled voice, that soft, pleading help. But I never look. Not anymore. I was 10 when it started. The strange noises. At first, they were easy to ignore, just creaks of the old house, or at least that's what my parents said. It was always at night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep. A faint tapping, like fingers brushing against the walls, or a soft shuffle from the corner of my room. I would lie still, eyes wide open in the dark, waiting for the sounds to stop. It wasn't every night. Sometimes weeks would go by, and I'd convince myself that it had all been in my head. But then, just when I thought it was over, it would return, closer this time, as if it were slowly, deliberately making its way toward me. One night, the sounds were louder than usual. A soft scraping, like something was dragging across the floor. It seemed to come from inside my closet. I lay in bed, frozen, listening as the noise grew closer, until it stopped directly behind the closet door. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I thought it would burst. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to fall asleep, to believe that it was all just a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. Something was there. In the morning, I tried to tell my parents. They laughed it off, saying it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. I wanted to believe them, but the sounds kept coming. A few days later, something changed. I was home alone after school, wandering the house like I always did when my parents were at work. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and for the first time in a while, I felt safe. The house was quiet, and the strange noises seemed like a distant memory. But as I passed my bedroom door, something caught my eye. The closet door, it was ajar. I stopped dead in my tracks. I never left it open. Slowly, I approached, my skin prickling with unease. I could feel a cold draft coming from inside. I reached out, hesitating for a moment, then gently pushed the door open. What I saw stopped me cold. Behind my clothes, half hidden by the hanging jackets and shirts, there was a small, dark opening. A passageway. My mind raced. How had I never noticed it before? It wasn't possible, but there it was, a narrow tunnel carved into the wall, leading into the blackness. The air that drifted from the passage was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of earth. I couldn't move, standing there at the threshold of something I didn't want to understand. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk drawer, flicked it on, and pointed it into the passage. The beam barely pierced the darkness, but I could see enough. The walls of the tunnel were rough, like they had been hastily dug, and there were scratch marks along the sides, as if something, or someone, had clawed its way through. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to shut the closet door, lock it, and pretend I had never seen it. But something inside me, something I couldn't explain, compelled me to crawl inside. The passage was tighter than I expected, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees. The cold earth beneath me felt wrong, too damp, too soft. My flashlight flickered as I moved further into the tunnel, the air growing colder with each step. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself that this was just an old part of the house, some forgotten space. But the further I went, the more wrong it felt. After what felt like forever, the passage opened into a small chamber. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, and at the far end of the room, there was a door I had never seen before. My breath caught in my throat. Who built this? Why was it here? I reached out to touch the handle, but before I could, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the other side of the door. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone or something was waiting for me. My flashlight flickered again, the light dimming as the tapping grew louder. I could hear the sound of breathing now, soft and slow, from just behind the door. I backed away, heart pounding, trying to stay calm, but the panic was rising in my chest. And then, the door handle slowly began to turn. I didn't wait. I turned and scrambled back through the tunnel, dirt and debris clinging to my clothes as I clawed my way out. The tapping followed me, growing more frantic the closer I got to the opening, like it was chasing me, desperate to catch me. I burst out of the closet and slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was silent again, the only sound my pounding heartbeat. I stood there, trembling, staring at the closed door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I never told my parents about the passageway. I never opened the closet again. But at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear it, the tapping. Berlin was never a quiet city, even at night. The hum of distant traffic and the occasional siren usually blended into a comforting white noise. But tonight was different. The city felt wrong, almost as if it were holding its breath. It was just past midnight, and I was making my usual way home from a late study session at the library. My route took me over one of the many bridges spanning the Spree River, a shortcut I had taken countless times without a second thought. But tonight, as I neared the bridge, I noticed something that made me slow down. There was someone standing in the shadows just out of sight of the streetlights. My gut twisted. I told myself to keep walking, eyes forward like nothing was wrong. But as I stepped onto the bridge, I saw something else. A car, parked awkwardly near the center, headlights off. The doors were open, and two men were standing beside it, their faces obscured by the dark. Something was happening, something I wasn't supposed to see. I glanced around quickly. There was no one else on the bridge, and I was too far from the main street to call for help. My pulse quickened as I weighed my options. I could turn around and head back, but they might see me, or I could keep walking, pretend I hadn't noticed them. My feet felt like they were glued to the pavement, indecision and panic battling inside me. Then I heard it, a muffled shout coming from inside the car. A man, his voice strained, desperate. I stopped, heart hammering in my chest. One of the men standing by the car glanced in my direction, his eyes narrowing as they landed on me. Panic surged through me. I shouldn't have stopped. I shouldn't have looked. Now they knew I had seen them. The man took a step toward me, slow and deliberate. His posture told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to let me walk away. I turned on my heel and started walking back the way I came, my mind racing. Keep it calm, don't run. But my body wasn't listening. The moment I heard his footsteps quicken behind me, I broke into a sprint. My shoes pounded against the pavement as I ran toward the far end of the bridge, the cold night air biting at my face. I could hear them now, both of them, their footsteps close behind, and a rush of adrenaline hit me like a wave. I was being chased. I didn't dare look back. The bridge seemed to stretch out forever, the end nowhere in sight. The sound of the men's footsteps grew louder, their voices barking at each other, but I couldn't make out the words. I knew I had to run faster, but my legs were already burning. The sound of heavy breathing filled my ears. Too close, far too close. I veered to the right, toward a narrow staircase leading down to the riverbank. My only chance was to lose them in the maze of pathways below. I bolted down the steps, nearly tripping in my haste. The stone steps were slick with dew, and I slid, catching myself just before I fell head first. The footsteps followed me, thundering down the stairs. They weren't giving up. I hit the bottom and darted left into a narrow alley that ran parallel to the river. The streetlights here were broken, leaving me in near-complete darkness. My lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even slow down. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car engine starting up. My blood ran cold. They weren't on foot anymore. I glanced behind me, just for a second, and saw headlights at the top of the stairs. The car was already barreling down toward the river, and I knew if I stayed on the path, they would find me. I turned sharply, crashing through a patch of overgrown bushes, my arms scraping against the branches. I could hear the car tires screeching as they tore through the streets, looking for me. The sound of the engine roared through the quiet night, a predator hunting its prey. I stumbled through the undergrowth, heading toward the riverbank. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but the car was getting closer. I could feel it. The roar of the engine bounced off the buildings, echoing in my ears. I emerged from the bushes onto a small, muddy path that ran alongside the river. I was exposed here, but I had no choice. The water glistened under the moonlight, the current strong and fast. I was trapped between the river and the city streets, with nowhere to go but forward. The headlights caught me again, bright, blinding. They had found me. The car swerved off the main road and onto the riverbank, tearing through the mud, racing straight toward me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran along the edge of the water. My legs were screaming in pain, my body barely able to keep up, but the car, it was too fast. I veered sharply to the right and ran down a steep embankment, sliding down the muddy slope toward the river. I hit the water hard, the cold shocking my system. I gasped, my body going numb almost instantly. But I didn't have time to think. The car was just above me, headlights piercing the darkness, searching. I dragged myself further into the water, the current tugging at my legs. I could hear them above me, shouting to each other, frustrated. They hadn't seen me go into the river. Not yet. I pressed myself against the bank, hiding in the shadow of the embankment, the cold water rising to my chest. My teeth chattered violently, and my body trembled with exhaustion and fear. Above me, the car idled for a moment, headlights scanning the riverbank. And then, slowly, the engine revved, and I heard the sound of tires spinning in the mud. They were moving again, heading back toward the bridge away from me. I stayed in the water for what felt like hours, my body numb, my heart pounding. When I finally pulled myself onto the bank, the night was eerily quiet. I was alone again, but I knew, as I staggered home, that I would never forget the sound of their footsteps or how close they had come. It was between classes, and I had barely made it to the bathroom in time. You know the feeling. You don't want to be that person sprinting through the hallways, but when nature calls, you can't exactly wait. Luckily, the bathroom was empty. Just the harsh buzz of the fluorescent lights and the faint drip of a leaking sink. That strange quiet you only get in school bathrooms when no one else is around. I headed straight for the last stall. Out of habit, something about being tucked away in the corner felt safer, more private. I locked the door behind me and sighed, relieved to have a moment to myself. The bell would ring soon, signaling the rush of students, but for now, it was just me. The stall door in front of me was scratched and worn, the walls covered in faded graffiti from past students. It should have felt normal, but it didn't. As I sat there, I noticed that the silence was different. It was too still. The usual muffled sounds of footsteps and chatter from the hall were gone, like they had been swallowed by the building itself. I felt a sudden unease, a creeping sensation that I wasn't as alone as I thought. And then there was a sound, a soft creak, like the bathroom door had opened. I tensed up, listening closely. No footsteps followed, just the door, and then nothing. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Someone else was in here, but they weren't moving. I couldn't hear a thing. No rustling, no footsteps, no water running. Just that faint, persistent hum of the lights. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, straining to listen. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe they had left. Then I heard it, the quiet tap of shoes on tile. So soft it could have been my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving closer to the stalls. My heart raced in my chest, each beat loud in my ears. I waited, hoping they'd move on, but the footsteps stopped just outside my stall. I froze. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence again. I stared at the floor beneath the stall, expecting to see feet any second now. But there was nothing. No shadow, no sign of anyone standing there. I bit my lip, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. That's when I heard the softest sound, breathing. It was faint but close, too close. My skin prickled as I realized it wasn't coming from outside the stall. It was behind me. I whipped around, my eyes locking onto the small gap between the stall and the wall. I felt my stomach drop. There was something there, a sliver of shadow, something dark, pressing close against the wall, as if someone or something was peering through the tiny crack. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to stay calm, to tell myself it wasn't real, that no one could be back there. The gap was too small, just a few inches wide. But then I saw it, a glint of something pale. An eye. It was staring at me. A cold wave of fear hit me, and I jumped up, fumbling with the lock on the stall door. The breathing grew louder, more ragged, as if whoever, or whatever, was back there knew I was panicking. The lock stuck, and for a moment, I was trapped, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I finally yanked the door open and stumbled out of the stall, heart racing, my eyes darting around the bathroom. It was empty. The door was closed, no sign of anyone. But I knew I had seen something, someone watching me from behind the stall. I wasn't alone in there. The bathroom felt colder now, the air heavy with something I couldn't explain. I ran to the sink, splashing cold water on my face, trying to shake the fear. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed pale. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the cracked tiles. I glanced back at the stalls, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the bathroom remained still, unnaturally quiet. My pulse was still pounding, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me. As I turned to leave, the bathroom door creaked open again. Slowly, just like before. I froze, staring at the door as it swung wider, revealing nothing but an empty hallway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I bolted out of the bathroom, never looking back. I could still feel eyes on me as I ran down the hall. And even after I was safe in the crowded corridors, surrounded by the familiar chaos of students, that feeling never went away. To this day, I don't know what it was that I saw behind the stall. Maybe it was just my imagination, my nerves playing tricks on me. But every time I use a bathroom alone, I check the stalls just to be sure. And sometimes, when it's quiet, I swear I can still hear that soft breathing. When I first rented the house, it seemed like a dream. A charming little place tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall oaks and the kind of peace you only get in a small town. After years of living in crowded apartments and noisy neighborhoods, I thought I had finally found somewhere I could breathe, somewhere I could be alone. But solitude, I soon learned, could be deceiving. The first couple of nights were blissful. The house had that old, creaky charm to it. Wooden floors that groaned underfoot, windows that rattled softly when the wind blew just right. I didn't mind it at first. It felt alive, like it had a personality of its own. But then came the notes. It was a Thursday, late evening. I had spent the day unpacking, trying to make the place feel like mine. After hours of work, I finally flopped down on the couch with a glass of wine, thinking the day was done. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper, folded neatly and wedged under the front door. Frowning, I set my glass down and went to pick it up. I unfolded it slowly, and my stomach tightened as I read the words scrawled hastily in shaky handwriting. I'm watching. My first thought was that it was some kind of joke, a prank played by one of the neighbors. It had to be. I laughed it off, crumpling the note and tossing it into the trash. But even as I sat back down, the unease lingered. Who would do that? And why? The next morning, I found another note. This time, it wasn't folded. It was tucked neatly into the mailbox, as if someone had placed it there just for me. The same messy handwriting, the same message. I'm watching. I stared at the note, my heart thudding in my chest. I glanced around the empty street, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. Just the quiet houses, their curtains drawn tight. For the next few days, the notes kept coming. Every day a new one. Sometimes they were on the porch, sometimes slipped under the door. Always the same message. I tried to ignore them, tried to brush it off as some cruel prank, but the constant pressure of it, knowing someone was out there, watching me, knowing when I was home, was beginning to get to me. I started locking the doors more often, double-checking the windows before bed. But the notes never stopped. Then one night, things escalated. It was late, past midnight, and the house was eerily quiet. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. Just one tap, then silence. I sat up, listening. Another tap. Louder this time. My heart raced. I stared at the window, the pale curtains barely stirring in the darkness. Slowly, I slipped out of bed, creeping toward the window, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I reached out, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing. The street outside was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. No one was there. I let the curtain fall back into place and turned to head back to bed. That's when I saw it. Another note, this time slipped under my bedroom door. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't heard the door open. With shaking hands, I picked up the note. My breath caught in my throat as I unfolded it. The familiar handwriting staring back at me. I'm closer than you think. A cold chill ran down my spine. I felt my hands tremble as I stood in the empty room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Someone had been in my house. While I slept, I checked the locks, every window, every door. Nothing had been broken or forced open. It was as if they had just walked in, The thought of someone being inside the house, watching me, listening as I slept, made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. I packed a bag that night, throwing in only the essentials. I couldn't even think straight, my mind racing with possibilities with fear. As I threw the bag over my shoulder and reached for the door handle, I froze. There was another note taped to the inside of the door. I hadn't noticed it before. I peeled it off, my fingers shaking. "Don't leave. I'll find you." My blood turned to ice. The threat was clear, the message undeniable. Whoever this was, they weren't just playing a prank anymore. They were serious. I bolted out of the house, not caring if I made noise. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get out to leave that place behind. I rented a room at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, far from the house, far from the notes. But even there, in the small, dim room, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, as I opened the door to step outside, my heart sank. There was a note, folded neatly on the ground, waiting for me. It was supposed to be a casual Tinder date. Just a few drinks, maybe some conversation, and then part ways. His name was Brad, and he seemed nice enough in our messages. Polite, a little charming, nothing that set off any red flags. I figured it'd be a low-stakes way to spend a Friday night. So when he suggested we meet at a quiet bar on the edge of town, I didn't think twice about it. I wish I had. The bar was small, tucked away from the busier parts of the city. Dim lights, faded leather seats, and a few scattered patrons. It wasn't exactly lively, but it felt safe enough. I arrived a little early and grabbed a seat near the back, texting Brad to let him know I was there. When he arrived, I was surprised. He looked nothing like his pictures. Older, rougher around the edges. His clothes were disheveled, and he had a certain nervous energy about him that made me uneasy. I brushed it off at first, telling myself not to be judgmental. First impressions weren't always accurate. We ordered drinks, made small talk, but something felt off. He kept glancing at his phone, fidgeting with the glass in front of him. His eyes kept darting to the door, as if he was waiting for someone or something. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, just a little distracted. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. But the tension between us was growing, thickening the air around us. It wasn't long before I noticed something else. Two men, sitting at the far end of the bar, kept looking in our direction. They were subtle about it at first, glancing over their shoulders, murmuring to each other. But as the night wore on, they became bolder, staring directly at us, as if they were waiting for something. The unease settled in my stomach, twisting like a knot. I wanted to ask Brad if he knew them, but his behavior was already strange enough. I didn't want to make things worse. Then he leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Hey, I need to ask you a favor." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of favor?" He glanced over at the men again, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "There's some people I owe a lot of money to. And, well," he trailed off, his eyes darting toward the door once more. My blood ran cold. "Brad, what are you talking about?" He licked his lips, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I need you to help me out. Just take something from me. It's a quick job. Drop it off somewhere, and we'll be square." I felt the walls closing in. "No, I'm not." "What the hell are you talking about?" "What do you mean? We'll be square?" "You owe them money, not me." He leaned in further, his voice growing urgent, desperate. "You don't get it. They're watching. I don't have a choice, okay? Neither do you now." My stomach dropped. I looked around the bar again, suddenly realizing how trapped I was. The two men at the end of the bar were no longer trying to be subtle. They were staring straight at me, their faces unreadable, their postures tense. I felt my skin prickle. "I'm not doing anything for you," I hissed, trying to keep my voice steady. I reached for my purse, ready to get up and leave, but Brad's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist tight. "Don't," he warned. His grip was too strong, his eyes wide with fear. "If you walk out now, they'll follow you. They're not going to let you leave until you take the package." A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I glanced at the men again. One of them was standing now, stretching casually, as if preparing to move toward me. I felt panic rising in my chest. "What's in the package?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Brad's grip tightened. "You don't need to know. Just take it, drop it off at the location, and you'll be fine. They'll leave you alone." I pulled my arm free, my pulse racing. "No, I'm not doing this." My voice wavered, and I knew I sounded scared, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to get out. Brad's face twisted with frustration, his eyes darting to the men. I could feel the tension in the room thicken. "Look," he whispered, leaning in close again, "if you don't help me, they're not going to let you walk out of here. You'll be in it whether you like it or not. Please just do this, and we can both get out." My heart pounded in my ears. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair back. I could feel everyone's eyes on me now. Brad, the two men at the bar, even the bartender who had been pretending not to notice. The walls seemed to close in around me, the bar shrinking as my pulse hammered in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. Without a word, I grabbed my purse and bolted for the door. I could hear Brad shouting my name, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I burst out into the cold night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward my car. I heard footsteps behind me, fast, urgent. They were following. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the car and threw myself inside. The moment the door slammed shut, I locked it, my heart hammering in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, just in time to see one of the men reach the edge of the parking lot, his face shadowed under the streetlight. He stopped, watching as I peeled out of the lot, his eyes following me. As I sped away, I could still feel their eyes on me, Brad's warning echoing in my head. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my apartment. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I've been checking my windows, waiting for the knock at the door. And when it comes, I know it won't be Brad. It started a few weeks ago, the black van. I noticed it parked outside my neighbor's house one night while I was having my usual late cigarette on the porch. It wasn't remarkable at first, just an old van with tinted windows, the kind you'd expect to see rusting away in a driveway. But something about it seemed out of place. My neighbor, Mr. Darrow, was an odd man, kept to himself, quiet, rarely seen during the day. He was the kind of guy no one knew much about, even though he had lived in the neighborhood for years. We waved at each other occasionally, but that was the extent of our relationship. His house, like him, was always a little too quiet, a little too still. The first night I saw the van, I didn't think much of it. But the next night, it was still there. And the night after that, always in the same spot, parked just off the street, half hidden in the shadows. No one ever got in or out. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I stood on my porch, cigarette in hand, watching the van. The street was silent. No movement anywhere except for the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. That's when I saw him, Mr. Darrow, standing in his front yard, staring at the van with a blank expression. His figure was barely visible in the dim light, but I could see the outline of his face, his eyes fixed on the van like he was waiting for something. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. Something about the way he stood there, completely still, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I called out to him a quiet, "Everything okay, Mr. Darrow?" He didn't respond. He didn't even move. I stubbed out my cigarette and went inside, trying to shake the strange feeling that lingered. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The van, the way Darrow had stood there like he was in a trance. The next night, the van was gone. I didn't see it again for a few days. I started to wonder if it had all been in my head, just an overactive imagination fueled by late-night cigarettes. But then the van came back, and this time it wasn't alone. 3 of them now, 3 identical black vans, parked in a row outside Darrow's house. It was as if they had appeared out of nowhere. I hadn't heard them arrive, hadn't seen anyone driving them. They were just there. That's when I started noticing the strange things. Mr. Darrow's lights would flicker late at night, long past the time when most people would be asleep. Shadows moved behind his curtains, multiple shadows, as if he had guests. But no one ever came to visit him. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. A week later, I decided to confront him. I hadn't seen Darrow in days, and the vans, now 5 of them, were still there, parked in perfect formation, their black windows gleaming in the moonlight. Something wasn't right. I walked up to his door, knocking lightly at first. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. The house was completely silent. I tried the door. It was unlocked. A terrible feeling settled in my gut, but I pushed the door open anyway. The house was dark, save for a faint light coming from the hallway. It smelled strange, like old wood and something sweet, almost like flowers. I called out his name, stepping inside cautiously. Mr. Darrow. No answer. I moved further into the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. As I reached the hallway, I saw something on the floor, a faint trail of dirt leading toward the back of the house. The light was coming from the kitchen. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know what was going on. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. The back door was open, and beyond it, in the backyard, the black vans were lined up side by side. But that wasn't what made me freeze. In the middle of the yard, Mr. Darrow was sitting in a chair. And he wasn't alone. 5 other people, neighbors I had seen around the street, were sitting in a circle around him. They were perfectly still, their heads bowed, as if they were all asleep. No one moved. I stepped closer, my throat tightening. Something was wrong. Their stillness wasn't natural. It was as if they were waiting. Mr. Darrow? I whispered. His head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes, they were completely empty, as if all life had drained out of him. But he was awake, staring at me with a strange intensity. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words never came. The silence around me felt suffocating, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Then, one by one, the others in the circle began to lift their heads. Slowly, mechanically. Their eyes, too, were empty. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. I turned and ran, bolting through the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I made it back to my house. I slammed the door shut behind me, my mind racing with what I had just seen. The vans were still out there. The people, my neighbors, had been sitting there lifeless in perfect silence. And yet, none of them had moved when I ran. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I called the police, but when they arrived, the vans were gone. No sign of Mr. Darrow, no sign of the neighbors. It was as if they had vanished. The only thing left was the faint trail of dirt leading to where they had been sitting. Days passed. None of the people I saw that night ever returned. Their houses stood empty, their mailboxes overflowing with unread letters. And every night, I wonder, how long until the vans come for me? Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you.